Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of our special series from the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour Podcast on the REINS Act. The REINS Act in focus. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and joining me right now, someone I was very excited to bring on, fan of the organization he works for many, many years, pretty much since its inception. His name is Jeremy Dalrymple. He is with the R Street Institute. Jeremy, I've got a good buddy named Jerry that I'm always talking to on the air. Jeremy, let's start with this, which is, your perception of where things stand with the REINS Act, why it's important, but what's with the stall? It's been removed from the now both versions of the reconciliation bill.
So from my understanding, it was originally removed from the House version at the request of Senator Mike Lee, who's long been a champion for the REINS Act. And his concern was that it would run afoul of the budgetary rules, specifically the Byrd Rule, for reconciliation. And so he'd asked the House to remove their language because it wasn't quite up to standard what the parliamentarian would accept. And so he wanted to put in his own language, which he thought would pass. As you just alluded to, unfortunately, it looks like the parliamentarian just ruled that no, it doesn't pass the Byrd bath test, and so it is likely going to be stripped. I think on that point, though, senators really do need to be reminded the parliamentarian just advises on this point. It's up to the senators. They're the ones that are actually voting on this. It's the chair that rules on this, and the only one that can actually overturn the chair is the senators. The parliamentarian, as R Street has long said, is just there to advise. And she doesn't always when she makes the calls, she doesn't always get it right. And so that's something that senators really need to focus on.
It's funny because I literally have a question here about whether or not the vice president should step in as president of the Senate. And I know his role is largely ceremonial. But so you think that the Senate Majority Leader and the senators generally should take a much stronger role in making sure that this gets included. I mean, we've had on Matthew Jensen from AFPI, and he talks about the fiscal impacts of regulation. The work that I do, I think that it's very clear that there is a fiscal impact to regulation, overregulation, but regulation generally, there's a fiscal impact here. How far should the Senate push this with regards to the parliamentarian?
Honestly, to me, all the way, as you just brought up, like when you're looking at the scoring for the bill and the scoring for this provision in particular, there have been studies out there from Crane has done a study for the National Manufacturers Association, and I think it did something around $3 trillion a year that they said was the economic impact for the regulations. And I know my friends over at Heritage, and I also think Epic too, have been looking at the studies for what happens if you just freeze regulations, right, which essentially that's what the REINS Act would do. Put a freeze on it until the important rules go through. And those are, I think the study came out, it was $1 trillion over a 10-year period that it would save from this.
Actually, it's funny. My own calculations, right? But, given the rates of growth over the years, Donald Trump in his first term grew the regulatory state by an unprecedented 1/3 of 1% annually. That's never happened before. And if you adjust that for inflation, I think you would find the regulatory costs actually declined. But right, if you don't grow the regulatory state at 5, 10, 15% per year, if you don't grow it at 15% a year, which is what the previous administration had been growing the state at, essentially in the next 5 years. There's a $4 trillion savings, and that's astounding in terms of the opportunity cost. So do you look at the REINS Act as an accountability issue? Do you look at it as an overregulation issue, or is it both?
I think it's both. I mean, Congress has often delegated its congressional power and legislative power to the administration, and this is something that needs to be rolled back. When they've done this, it's dodged responsibility for their consequences. I think as Senator Mike Lee has said, it's about putting Congress back in the driver's seat where it belongs. And I think what was the second part of your question?
Well, no, I don't even remember. Well, I think I asked whether or not it was either accountability or about regulation, but actually it's a good pivot to talk about the work and the perspective of R Street, which, has always been very, very thoughtful and very analytical. Because, one of the cases that I've been talking about is if you are concerned about the concentration of power in the federal executive branch, then, regardless of where you sit on the aisle, right, Democrat or Republican, you should be in favor of something like the REINS Act from that perspective. If the power of the executive branch is expressed in the size and scope of the regulatory state, having a regulation that costs the American economy $100 million a year or more, that's a huge jump in that expansion of power. Your thoughts on this? And the I mean, I don't know how it works at our street, if individual scholars have their own opinion or if there's an institutional, but your thoughts on this issue of why Democrats ought to be taking a closer look at the REINS Act.
Absolutely. And I'll caveat with the boilerplate language of these are my opinions, not
Right.
necessarily that of our street.
Perfect. No,
Yeah.
I just didn't know. For some entities, believe me, it gets blurred in my own work, and I'm constantly having to talk about that issue. But go ahead, please.
I think it's definitely isn't about the left or right here. It's about who governs. So whether you feel like climate mandates or corporate favoritism, the REIN Act really gives voters a lever to hold their elected officials accountable. You have a vote that's going to be on the record, which is something you don't have now with unelected bureaucrats who are just passing these regulations. Yes, there is a comment period, but often it's kind of watered down now. And when you have particularly all these comments coming in, it's hard for you all the bureaucrats to actually go through these and actually meaningfully give them weight to them. So now you have both parties that have used the bureaucracy to like bypass debate and public scrutiny. And I think the REINS Act brings that back in.
No, that's an excellent point on this. As someone who was literally in the process of drafting comments on a healthcare issue, yeah, I mean it obviously I'm a firm believer in the notice and comment process. But, when you turn around and you see whether or not things are getting responded to and how, yeah, that's a little tough. So there is this issue of who governs and how they govern and how tightly they're controlled. And this is especially true in light of last year's Loper Bright and relentless decisions, right? Striking down the Chevron doctrine. I've been asking a couple of our colleagues in the regulatory sphere about why it is that so many legislators don't actually want that power, why they want to push it back. They're the so-called Stop Corporate Capture Act in the wake of the Loper Bright decision last year, pushing this power back into the executive branch. What's your read, Jeremy, as to why they don't want to have a role in this? Many of them do, but yeah.
I think when the framers were writing the Constitution, they didn't actually envision that Congress would want to outsource its lawmaking to the executive branch. They always viewed Congress as being the first branch. And so when they delegate the power here, it's also delegating responsibility. They don't have to own these decisions. So when they go back to their constituents, during the August recess, it's not something that they can be, hit over the head with. But I think it's something that it's really important for Congress to own these decisions now. These, as you said, are major economic impacts. This rule specifically looks at the 100 million regulations that are 100 million. So it's something that's not insignificant.
Right.
And
No, so go ahead, please. You were about to finish your thought, and I
I think it's something that's important for Congress to bring back and to actually be able to own at this point and to be able to explain their votes on this.
Right, and again, it cuts both ways, right? If you are a Democrat and there's a Republican president, and that Republican president starts to engage in executive branch, what you consider to be executive branch overreach, right? It flips it on its head. I mean, I guess this is the other part of it you can talk a little bit about, because we have the Congressional Review Act, and anybody can bring up something under the Congressional Review Act, but this flips it on its head. This puts the matter squarely in Congress's role, so that anytime a president does this. Now, I'm not saying that this is a silver bullet, because there are all kinds of ancillary impacts. But talk about that issue. Talk about the issue of it represents this check, so that when the party that you disagree with is in power, you have a say in this. Talk about this.
No, I think that's an excellent point that you bring up. So the thing with the CRA is it's reactive,
Yeah.
and it's only been, I think it's been used, 30 times
Yeah.
almost in the last decade.
Couple
So
of
it's very
handfuls of
limited.
times.
Right.
An
It's very
octopus is
limited.
handful. Yes.
So the REINS Act is really proactive in this, and it really puts Congress back in the driver's seat for it. It also makes, on the flip side of it, puts agencies, they're forced to justify their rules.
Yeah.
Because in order to justify it, you have to gain congressional approval. And so hopefully with that kind of process, they'll propose fewer bad regulations. And I think that's part of the point of this too.
Well, Jeremy, I want to get you back to talk more in detail about the work that you're doing, but in the meantime, tell us just a little bit about how you got involved with R Street and how folks find out more about the organization.
Absolutely. So we're at rstreet.org. We have all of our brilliant pieces up there from all the people that I work with. I have recently just joined R Street. I'm coming from 2 years at Senate PSI, which is the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, where I've been doing oversight investigations work for Senator Johnson's team for the last 2 years. Before that, I was 4 years at Heritage doing budget work, and then and before that, I was on Senate budget doing reconciliation. So it's feeling like coming home almost.
Well, I appreciate your perspective in that regard on this issue of reconciliation and the parliamentarian and the power of the parliamentarian. So thank you so very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Our guest has been Jeremy Dalrymple with the R Street Institute. Check them out at rstreet.org. I'm Andrew Langer. Yes, the dogs are barking in the background. Thank you all for joining us on yet this next edition of this special series on the REINS Act in Focus. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.